The gunshot echoed through the empty street of Tucson, Arizona, like thunder on a cloudless day, and Orville Harding didn't flinch. Death had been stalking him for so long that he'd grown accustomed to its persistent shadow, much like the dust that perpetually clung to his worn leather boots. It was 1878, and Tucson was growing faster than a weed after a desert rain. The Southern Pacific Railroad had brought new life to the town, along with the usual mix of opportunists, desperados, and those simply seeking a fresh start in the unforgiving frontier. Orville wasn't any of these. At 35, he'd spent most of his adult life on horseback, driving cattle across the territories, and building a reputation as a man who kept to himself and his work. "That was a warning shot, Harding," shouted Lester Pike from across the street. "Next one goes between your eyes." Pike was the newest in a long line of young gunslingers looking to make a name for themselves. Taking down the infamous Ghost Rider would cement any man's reputation from Tucson to Tombstone. Orville sighed, his hand hovering near his holster. "You sure about this, boy?" "There's still time to walk away." The crowd that had gathered along the boardwalks murmured. Some placed bets. Others shook their heads in pity, not for Orville, but for the young fool challenging him. "Everyone knows you're washed up, old man," Pike sneered, his confidence bolstered by whiskey and ignorance. "They say you'll die alone in the desert someday, with only the vultures to mark your passing." Orville's weathered face revealed nothing, but the words stung more than he cared to admit. It wasn't the first time he'd heard such sentiments. The life of a cowboy didn't lend itself to lasting connections. Men like him rode hard, lived fast, and typically met early ends alone. The standoff might have continued, but fate intervened in the form of Sheriff Emmett Wilson, who stepped between them, his shotgun raised. "That's enough, Pike. Holster that gun or spend the night in my jail." Pike hesitated, his youthful bravado wavering in the face of actual authority. "And you," Wilson turned to Orville, "I thought you were passing through." "I am," Orville replied evenly, "just needed supplies." "Well, get them and be on your way. Don't need your kind of trouble here." "Your kind of trouble." The words followed Orville into Donovan's general store, where he methodically gathered what he needed: coffee, beans, ammunition, and tobacco. "Don't mind the sheriff," said Old Man Donovan as he tallied Orville's purchases. "He's jumpy since those Barlow boys started causing trouble up north." Orville nodded, uninterested in local politics or outlaws. He had a job waiting a cattle drive from a ranch outside Tucson to the railhead in Maricopa. It would keep him occupied, keep him moving. That's all he needed. As he loaded his supplies onto his dappled gray gelding, Shade, the sound of raised voices caught his attention. Down the street, outside the doctor's office, a woman was engaged in a heated discussion with a man in a fine suit. "I don't care what it costs, Mr. Reynolds. These people need medicine, and I need to get it to them." Her voice carried, clear and determined. "Miss Rivers, be reasonable. The Apache reservation is 30 miles into dangerous territory. No one will take you out there, especially with rumors of renegades in the hills." Orville should have mounted Shade and ridden out of town. That would have been the sensible choice, the one aligned with his solitary existence. Instead, he found himself leading his horse toward the argument. The woman Miss Rivers was striking, not in the conventional way of the painted ladies at the Silver Dollar Saloon, but in her fierce demeanor. Her chestnut hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her simple dress spoke of function over fashion. When she turned to face him, Orville was caught off guard by the intensity in her hazel eyes. "Can I help you?" she asked, clearly not in the mood for interruptions. "Couldn't help overhearing," Orville said, his voice rough from disuse. "You're looking to reach the Apache reservation." Reynolds, a bank manager by the look of his attire, scoffed. "Don't waste your breath, Miss Rivers. This is obviously one of those drifters looking for easy money." The woman, Miss Rivers, studied Orville with a calculating gaze. "Are you familiar with the route to the San Carlos reservation?" "I am." "And you'd be willing to escort me there?" Orville should have said no. He had a job waiting, commitments made. But something in her determination resonated with him. "I have a cattle drive starting in 3 days. If you can be ready to leave at dawn tomorrow, we can make it there and back in time." Reynolds sputtered. "This is madness, Miss Rivers. You cannot seriously consider—" "My name is Madeline," she said, ignoring Reynolds and extending her hand to Orville. "Madeline Rivers. I'm a nurse with the Territorial Health Commission." Orville hesitated before taking her hand, conscious of his calloused palm against her smoother one. "Orville Harding." Recognition flashed in her eyes. "The Ghost Rider," he winced at the moniker. "Just a cowboy, madam." "Well, just a cowboy. I accept your offer. I'll be ready at dawn with supplies and payment for your services." As Orville rode out to make camp on the outskirts of town, he wasn't welcome at the hotel. After his confrontation with Pike, he wondered what had possessed him to make such an offer. The Apache situation was complicated. The reservation conditions were deplorable, with disease running rampant due to overcrowding and poor supplies. It was a powder keg of resentment and suffering. And now, he had volunteered to escort a headstrong nurse into that volatile situation, potentially delaying his legitimate work in the process. "Must be getting soft in my old age," he muttered to Shade as he set up his sparse camp. The horse nickered in what sounded suspiciously like agreement. Dawn broke over the desert with the promise of a scorching day. Orville had already broken camp and was waiting at the edge of town when he spotted Madeline approaching. She had exchanged her dress for practical riding clothes, split skirt, sturdy boots, and a wide-brimmed hat. Behind her, a mule was laden with crates that presumably contained medical supplies. "Mr. Harding," she greeted him with a nod. "I appreciate your punctuality." "Best to get moving before the heat sets in," he replied, eyeing the mule. "That animal going to keep up?" "Bessie is stronger than she looks," Madeline patted the mule affectionately, "and more stubborn than any man I've met, which is saying something." Orville's mouth twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "We'll see about that. Ready to ride." They set off at a steady pace, Orville leading the way on Shade, with Madeline and Bessie following. The desert landscape stretched before them, the early morning light painting the cacti and rock formations in soft gold. They rode in silence for the first hour, which suited Orville fine. He wasn't one for idle conversation, but eventually curiosity got the better of Madeline. "So, Mr. Harding, how does a man earn the name Ghost Rider?" she asked, drawing her horse alongside his. Orville kept his eyes on the horizon. "By minding his own business and letting others mind theirs." "That's not much of an answer." "Wasn't much of a question," she laughed, a surprisingly melodious sound in the desert quiet. "Fair enough. Let me try again. How long have you been a cowboy?" "Since I was 15. Started as a wrangler in Texas, worked my way up." "And now you're, what?" "A hired gun, a trail boss. I do what needs doing," he said simply. "Sometimes that's driving cattle, sometimes it's tracking rustlers. Right now it's escorting a stubborn nurse to an Apache reservation." Madeline smiled, undeterred by his gruffness. "Well, I'm grateful for it." Not many in Tucson were willing to help. They see the Apache as enemies, not people in need. "Most folks see what's convenient to see," Orville replied. "Makes life simpler." "And what do you see when you look at the Apache?" Orville considered this. "People trying to survive, same as anyone. Just with worse odds stacked against them." Madeline studied him with newfound interest. "That's Surprisingly compassionate coming from a man with your reputation. Reputations are like shadows. They follow you around but don't tell the whole story. The conversation lulled as they navigated a rocky stretch, but Orville found himself less bothered by her questions than he might have expected. There was something refreshing about her directness. By midday, the sun was merciless, and they stopped in the shade of a rocky outcropping to rest the animals and eat a simple meal of jerky and hardtack. Madeline produced a canteen of water mixed with lemon and sugar, offering it to Orville. "Helps with the heat," she explained. He took a cautious sip and nodded in approval. "You've done this before, traveling in rough country, I mean." "I grew up in Colorado," she said. "My father was a doctor who believed in treating everyone, regardless of race or means. We often traveled to mining camps and remote settlements." Her expression softened with memory. "He taught me that medicine isn't just about curing diseases, it's about respecting human dignity." "Your father sounds like an unusual man." "He was," she agreed, a hint of sadness in her voice. "He died last year, pneumonia." Ironic for a man who saved so many others from the same fate. "I'm sorry," Orville said, and meant it. "Thank you." She brushed a stray lock of hair from her face. "What about your family?" "Don't have one," he said flatly. "Not anymore." Madeline seemed to sense the boundary and didn't press further. Instead, she changed the subject. "How much farther to the reservation?" "We'll camp tonight near Cactus Creek. Should reach San Carlos by tomorrow afternoon, barring trouble." "What kind of trouble are we likely to encounter?" Orville recapped his canteen. "Renegade Apache who have left the reservation mostly. Some are just hunting parties looking for food. Others are warriors under leaders like Geronimo who refuse to accept reservation life. Would they attack us? Depends on their mood and how desperate they are. But they're more likely to leave us alone if we don't look like a threat." He glanced at the medical supplies. "Or if they see value in what we're bringing." They resumed their journey, the heat building to a crescendo before finally beginning to wane as the afternoon progressed. The landscape changed subtly, with more vegetation appearing as they approached the foothills that would eventually lead to the mountains. As dusk approached, Orville led them to a small grove of mesquite trees near a trickling creek, a precious water source in the arid landscape. "We'll camp here," he announced, dismounting and beginning to unsaddle Shade. Madeline proved herself capable and self-sufficient, setting up her own bedroll and helping gather wood for a small fire. As darkness fell, they sat across from each other, the flames casting flickering shadows on their faces. "Why did you agree to take me to San Carlos?" Madeline asked suddenly. Orville, in the process of rolling a cigarette, paused. "Seemed like the right thing to do." "Most men in Tucson thought the right thing was to tell me I was foolish for even considering the journey." "Most men in Tucson are idiots," he said matter-of-factly, striking a match against his boot. Madeline laughed, the sound bright against the night's quiet. "That's hard to argue with." She grew more serious. "But truly, Mr. Harding, I appreciate your help. These supplies could save many lives. The conditions on the reservation are deplorable." Orville exhaled a stream of smoke. "Government promises rarely hold up when it comes to the Indians." "You sound like you speak from experience." He shrugged. "I've seen enough broken treaties and forced relocations to know how the story usually ends." Madeline wrapped her arms around her knees, her expression thoughtful in the firelight. "My father used to say that one person can't change the whole world, but they can change the world for one person, or in this case, maybe a few dozen people." "Noble sentiment," Orville acknowledged, "but sentiment doesn't count for much out here." "Action counts," she countered. "That's why I'm here. That's why you're helping me, despite your claims of just being a cowboy minding his own business." Orville didn't have a response for that, so he offered her a cigarette instead. To his surprise, she accepted, handling it with the ease of someone who'd done so before. "Learned from the miners' wives in Colorado," she explained, seeing his expression. "Scandalous, I know. Takes more than a woman smoking to scandalize me, Miss Rivers." "Madeline," she corrected. "If we're going to face potential danger together, I think we can dispense with formalities." "Madeline," he conceded, finding he liked the way her name felt when he said it. They talked a while longer, Madeline sharing stories of her work with the Health Commission, and Orville occasionally offering terse anecdotes from his years on the trail. It was the most he'd spoken to anyone in months, possibly years, and he found it surprisingly easy with her. Eventually, Madeline retired to her bedroll while Orville took first watch. The night was clear, stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. In the distance, a coyote called, its lonely howl echoing through the desert. Alone but for the sleeping woman and the grazing animals, Orville reflected on Pike's taunt. "They say you'll die alone in the desert someday, with only the vultures to mark your passing." It wasn't an unreasonable prediction. Men like him seldom died in bed surrounded by loved ones. The cowboy's life was solitary by design, filled with long stretches of emptiness, punctuated by moments of intense danger or activity. He'd accepted that fate long ago. Yet, as he glanced at Madeline's sleeping form, a strange feeling stirred within him, not quite regret, but a wondering about paths not taken. He shook it off. One act of decency didn't change the course of a man's life. Come tomorrow, he would deliver Madeline safely to the reservation, and then they would part ways. She would return to her mission of healing, and he would return to his cattle drive and the solitary life he knew. That was the natural order of things. The next morning dawned cool and clear, but Orville knew the reprieve would be short-lived. They broke camp efficiently, Madeline again impressing him with her practicality and lack of complaints. As they rode, the terrain grew more challenging, with steep inclines and rocky passages that required careful navigation. Madeline handled her horse admirably, and even Bessie proved her worth, picking her way through difficult sections with surprising grace for such a stubborn creature. "You ride well," Orville commented during a brief rest. "Thank you," Madeline replied, brushing dust from her sleeve. "Though I admit my muscles will be protesting tomorrow. Most people would be complaining by now." She gave him a wry smile. "Would complaining make the journey any easier?" "No." "Then what would be the point?" She took a swig from her canteen. "Besides, I'm too focused on what we'll find at San Carlos to worry about a few aches. What exactly are you bringing them?" Orville nodded toward the crates on the mule. "Quinine for malaria, medicines for respiratory ailments, bandages, antiseptics. Basic supplies but desperately needed." Her expression darkened. "The last report I received mentioned an outbreak of measles among the children. Without proper care, the mortality rate could be devastating." Orville nodded grimly. Disease had always been a more effective killer of indigenous peoples than any bullet or blade. "You plan to stay and treat them?" "For a few days, yes. I need to train some of their healers on using these medicines properly." She tilted her head. "Will that interfere with your cattle drive?" "I can spare the time," he said, surprising himself with the offer. "To make sure you get back to Tucson safely." Gratitude flickered in her eyes. "I would appreciate that, though I don't want to impose further on your generosity." "It's not generosity," he said gruffly. "Just common sense. These hills aren't safe for a woman traveling alone." They continued their journey, the sun climbing higher in the sky, baking the rocky landscape. By mid-afternoon, they crested a ridge that offered a view of the San Carlos reservation in the valley below. From their vantage point, They could see the sprawl of simple dwellings, smoke rising from cooking fires, and people moving about like ants in the distance. Even from here, the contrast was stark between the lush natural landscape surrounding the area and the barren, overcrowded conditions of the reservation itself. "There it is," Madeline said softly. "Home to over 4,000 Apache from different bands, all forced onto land that can barely sustain a quarter of that number." Orville said nothing, but his jaw tightened at the sight. He'd seen reservations before, and the story was always the same: proud people reduced to dependency, their traditional ways of life disrupted, their health and spirits deteriorating under conditions that would break most men. As they descended toward the reservation, Orville noticed movement on a ridge to their west. He raised a hand, signaling Madeline to stop. "What is it?" she asked, voice lowered. "Riders, 3 of them." He squinted against the sun. "Apache watching us. Should we be concerned?" "Not yet," he said, keeping his hand near his holster nonetheless. "They're just being cautious. Let's keep moving, but slowly. No sudden movements." They continued their descent, and Orville was acutely aware of being watched. The Apache riders paralleled their course, staying just visible enough to send a message. "We see you." When they reached the outskirts of the reservation, they were met by a small party led by a man in a mix of traditional Apache and Western clothing. His face was weathered, his eyes sharp and assessing. "I am Na Ka Yen," he introduced himself in accented but clear English. "Who are you and what brings you to San Carlos?" Madeline urged her horse forward. "My name is Madeline Rivers. I'm a nurse with the Territorial Health Commission. I've brought medicines and supplies, especially for the measles outbreak." Na Ka Yen's expression remained guarded, but there was a flicker of something, perhaps hope, in his eyes. He turned to Orville. "And you, Orville Harding," he replied simply. "I'm escorting Miss Rivers." Recognition dawned on the Apache man's face. "The Ghost Rider. Your reputation travels even to our isolated home." There was no hostility in his tone, merely observation. "Just a cowboy doing a job," Orville said, echoing his words to Madeline. Na Ka Yen seemed to assess them both for a moment longer before nodding. "Come. Our healer, Many Stars, will want to speak with you." They were led into the heart of the reservation, where curious eyes followed their progress. Children darted alongside their horses, while elders watched from the doorways of simple dwellings. Orville noticed the signs of hardship immediately. 2 thin faces, clothing that had been mended multiple times, the listlessness in some of the gazes that followed them. They were brought to a larger structure that served as both a meeting place and a makeshift infirmary. Inside, an elderly woman was tending to several children who lay on pallets, their faces flushed with fever. "Many Stars," Na Ka Yen said. "This is the nurse from the white man's government. She has brought medicine." Many Stars straightened slowly, her aged body betraying the pain of arthritis, but her eyes were clear and intelligent. She spoke in Apache, which Na Ka Yen translated. "She welcomes you and asks what you have brought to fight the spotted sickness that takes our children." Madeline dismounted immediately and approached, her manner respectful but confident. "Tell her I've brought medicines that will help ease the symptoms and prevent more children from becoming ill. I also have knowledge to share, if she is willing to learn from me as I would learn from her." When this was translated, Many Stars studied Madeline intently before nodding once, decisively. She spoke again, and Na Ka Yen smiled slightly as he translated. "She says she can see you have a healer's heart, and that wisdom recognizes wisdom across the boundaries of language and race." Orville watched as Madeline immediately set to work, organizing her supplies and explaining their uses through Na Ka Yen. She moved with purpose and compassion, her focus entirely on the task at hand. Within minutes, she had integrated herself into the infirmary routine, working alongside many stars as if they'd been partners for years. "Your woman has a gift," Na Ka-yen commented to Orville, who had remained near the entrance. "She's not my woman," Orville corrected automatically. "Just someone I'm helping." The Apache man gave him a knowing look that Orville chose to ignore. "Is there somewhere I can tend to the horses?" he asked, preferring action to standing around uselessly. Na Ka-yen nodded. "Follow me." "We can offer simple hospitality, though our resources are limited." Orville spent the remainder of the day caring for Shade and Bessie, then assisting with some repairs around the reservation. The Apache were initially wary of him, but his willingness to work alongside them and his respectful manner gradually eased tensions. As evening approached, he made his way back to the infirmary to check on Madeline. He found her still at work, her hair now loosened from its bun, her face showing signs of exhaustion but her movements still deliberate and gentle as she tended to a young boy. "You should rest," he said, approaching her after she had finished. She looked up, surprise in her eyes as if she'd forgotten he was there. "There's still much to do, and it will be there in the morning," he countered. "You won't help anyone if you collapse from exhaustion." Many stars who had been observing spoke up, with Na Ka-yen translating. "The Ghost Rider speaks wisdom. Our children are already breathing easier thanks to your medicines. Rest now and continue your good work tomorrow." Madeline hesitated, then nodded. "You're right, of course. Thank you." They were provided with a small dwelling for the night, a simple structure with 2 sleeping areas separated by a woven curtain for privacy. After a meal of beans, corn, and what appeared to be rabbit stew, they retired to their respective spaces. Orville lay on his bedroll, listening to the sounds of the reservation settling for the night, distant conversations, a baby crying, someone playing a flute-like instrument whose haunting melody drifted through the desert air. "Orville," Madeline's voice came softly from beyond the curtain. "Are you awake?" "Yes," he answered, staring at the thatched ceiling. "Thank you for today, for bringing me here, for waiting. Just doing what I said I would." There was a pause then. "Many stars asked me about you. She wanted to know if you were my husband." Orville's heart did an unexpected flip. "What did you tell her?" "The truth. That you're a cowboy who was kind enough to help me." Another pause. "She said that kindness is rare in these times and that I should consider it a sign." "Apache are superstitious," he said, though his mouth had gone dry. "Perhaps," Madeline conceded. "Or perhaps they simply see things more clearly than we do. Good night, Orville." "Good night," he replied, but sleep was long in coming. The next day brought a flurry of activity as Madeline continued her work with the sick children and began training several Apache women in basic medical procedures. The measles cases were responding well to her treatments, and there was a palpable sense of relief among the parents. Orville found himself drawn into the community's daily life, helping with hunting, repairs, and even teaching some of the younger men better techniques for working with horses. It was the most settled he'd felt in years, though he tried not to examine that feeling too closely. On their 3rd day at the reservation, as he was showing a group of boys how to properly saddle a horse, he noticed a commotion at the perimeter. A rider had arrived, clearly exhausted and bearing news of some urgency. Na Ka-yen sought him out moments later, his expression grave. "There is trouble," he said without preamble. "A band of warriors from the mountains raided a white settlement 2 days ago. The army is responding, and they do not always distinguish between peaceful reservation Apache and those who fight." Orville understood immediately. "They might come here." "It is possible," Na Ka-yen confirmed. The commander at Fort Grant is not known for his restraint or his wisdom. We should leave, Orville said, already thinking of Madeline's safety. Today, if possible. Your concern is for your nurse, Na Ka-yen observed. But consider this. Her presence here, a white woman caring for Apache children, might stay the soldiers' hands if they come. The thought had occurred to Orville as well, but he dismissed it. I won't use her as a shield, and I won't risk her being caught in the middle if fighting breaks out. When he found Madeline and explained the situation, he expected resistance. Instead, she surprised him with her practical response. We'll need to pack the remaining medicines, she said, already moving to organize her supplies. And I'll need to give many stars final instructions on treatments. You're willing to leave? He asked. Caught off guard by her ready agreement, she gave him a steady look. I'm not a fool, Orville. I understand the danger, but I also won't abandon these people without ensuring they can continue treatments in my absence. Her expression softened. Besides, I trust your judgment. If you say we need to go, then we need to go. They worked quickly, packing essential supplies while leaving enough medicine behind to treat the current patients. Many stars listened intently to Madeline's final instructions, her wrinkled hands clasping Madeline's in a gesture of friendship and gratitude. She says you have brought hope, and that is a medicine more powerful than any root or powder. Na Ka-yen translated. Madeline's eyes glistened with unshed tears. Tell her I have learned as much from her as she has from me, and that I will return when I can. By mid-afternoon, they were ready to depart. The entire community gathered to see them off, many bringing small gifts. A woven basket, a beaded bracelet, dried herbs carefully wrapped in cloth. These people have so little, yet they give so generously, Madeline murmured as she secured the gifts in her saddlebag. That's often the way of it, Orville replied. Those who have least give most. As they prepared to mount up, Na Ka-yen approached with a final message. Many stars says the ghost rider will not die alone, as the white men say. She has seen another path for you. Orville shifted uncomfortably. Tell her I appreciate the thought. They set off with the sun still high, taking a different route than their arrival, one that Na Ka-yen had suggested might help them avoid any army patrols. The way was rougher, leading through rocky canyons and dense brush, but it offered better cover. They rode hard until dusk, putting as much distance between themselves and San Carlos as possible. When they finally stopped to make camp in a sheltered arroyo, both humans and animals were exhausted. You think they'll be safe? Madeline asked as they tended to the horses. The Apache have survived worse, Orville replied, though he wasn't entirely confident. The U.S. Army had a history of indiscriminate actions against indigenous peoples, regardless of whether they'd been involved in hostilities. It's not right, she said, anger creeping into her voice. They're already confined to land that can barely sustain them, denied their traditional ways of life, and now they're at risk of punishment for actions they didn't commit. No, it's not right, he agreed, but right doesn't always factor into these situations. They ate a cold meal, not risking a fire that might attract attention. As night deepened around them, the desert came alive with sounds. The rustle of creatures in the brush, the distant call of a hunting owl, the whisper of wind through the canyon. We should reach Tucson by tomorrow evening if we push hard, Orville said, calculating the distance in his mind. I need to check in with the ranch about the cattle drive. Of course, Madeline nodded. I wouldn't want to delay your work further. There was something in her tone that made him look at her more closely. Is something wrong? She hesitated, then said, I was thinking about what happens after we return. You'll go on your cattle drive and I'll continue my work with the commission. It seems strange that after these intense few days together, we'll simply, Part ways. The thought had been nagging at Orville as well, though he'd been trying to ignore it. That's the nature of things out here. Paths cross, then diverge. Is that all this is to you, paths crossing? The directness of her question caught him off guard. I'm a cowboy, Madeline. I don't put down roots. I don't stay in one place. I'm not asking you to, she said, her voice soft but steady. I'm just wondering if what happened between us at San Carlos meant anything to you. What happened between us? Don't pretend you don't know what I mean, she said, a hint of frustration breaking through. The way we worked together, the way we understood each other without words, the way you looked at me when you thought I wouldn't notice. Orville fell silent, unsure how to respond. He'd spent so many years keeping people at a distance that the idea of acknowledging these emerging feelings was foreign and frightening. I'm not good for anyone, Madeline, he finally said. Men like me were better off alone. Safer. Safer for whom? She challenged. For you, hiding behind that wall you've built. Or for the people who might care about you, who you keep pushing away. Her words struck a chord, hitting uncomfortably close to truths he'd avoided confronting. You don't know me, he said, his voice rougher than he intended. You don't know the things I've done, the kind of man I am. I know enough, she said simply. I know you're honorable. I know you're kind despite your efforts to hide it. I know you risked your life to help me help others. Orville stood abruptly, needing space. I'll take first watch. You should get some sleep. He walked to the edge of their camp, frustration and confusion roiling within him. Madeline's words had unsettled something fundamental, cracking the carefully constructed shell he'd built around himself. The night passed slowly, each taking turns to watch while the other slept fitfully. When dawn broke, they prepared to leave in silence, the easy camaraderie of previous days replaced by a tangible tension. They had been riding for perhaps an hour when Orville spotted dust on the horizon behind them, riders moving fast. Trouble, he said tersely, pointing. Could be the army, could be Apache. Either way, we need to move. They urged their mounts faster, but the laden mule couldn't match the pace of horses at full gallop. The dust cloud grew larger, resolving into a group of 5 riders. It's not the army, Orville said grimly, recognizing the lack of uniformity in the approaching group. Looks like raiders, Apache or Mexican, can't tell from here. What do we do? Madeline asked, her voice steady despite the danger. Orville scanned their surroundings, spotting a rocky outcropping that would provide some cover. There, he pointed, we make for those rocks. If it comes to a fight, at least we'll have some protection. They reached the outcropping just as the riders came within rifle range. Orville helped Madeline dismount and led the animals into a natural corral formed by the rocks. Stay down, he instructed, drawing his Winchester from its saddle scabbard. If something happens to me, take shade and ride for Tucson. Don't stop for anything. I'm not leaving you, she said firmly, producing a small derringer from her pocket. And I'm not helpless. Before he could argue, a voice called out in heavily accented English. You there, in the rocks. We know you come from the Apache. Give us the supplies you carry and perhaps we let you live. Raiders, Orville muttered. Probably figured we're carrying something valuable from the reservation. The medicine, Madeline realized. We can't let them take it. The children at San Carlos need it. Orville weighed their options. 5 against 1 were poor odds, even with the advantage of cover. I'll try to talk to them, he decided. Stay hidden. He stood carefully, keeping his rifle ready but not aimed directly at the raiders who had stopped about 50 yards away. We're just travelers heading to Tucson, he called. We don't want trouble. The leader, a hard-faced man with a scar running down one cheek, laughed. Ghost Rider does not travel with woman for pleasure. You carry something of value. Give it to us and we go our way. So they knew who he was. That complicated matters. The only thing of value we're carrying is medicine for sick children, Orville replied. Nothing worth dying for. The leader conferred briefly with his companions, then turned back. Maybe we take the woman too. Good price for white woman in certain places. Anger flared in Orville's chest, hot and dangerous. That's not going to happen, he said, his voice dropping to the deadly quiet that had earned him his reputation. The raiders spread out, preparing to rush the outcropping from multiple angles. Orville knew they were out of options. Last chance, he called. Ride away now and everyone lives. The leader's response was to raise his rifle and fire, the bullet chipping stone inches from Orville's head. What followed was a chaotic exchange of gunfire. Orville picked his shots carefully, dropping one raider with a clean hit and winging another. But they were closing in, using the terrain for cover as they advanced. A bullet grazed Orville's arm, burning like a branding iron. He hissed, but kept firing, aware that their ammunition wouldn't last indefinitely. Suddenly, from behind him, Madeline's Derringer barked twice in rapid succession. One of the raiders who had been trying to flank their position clutched his shoulder and fell back. "Told you I wasn't helpless," she said, crouching beside him. The odds had improved slightly. 2 raiders wounded, one down permanently, but the remaining 3 were still pressing their attack. Orville was down to his last few rifle cartridges, with only his revolver as backup. Then, just as the situation seemed most dire, the distinctive crack of rifle fire came from an unexpected direction. 2 of the raiders fell in quick succession, while the third, the leader, turned his horse and fled. From a ridge to their east, 3 mounted Apache warriors appeared, rifles in hand. Orville recognized one of them as a man from San Carlos named Tall Tree. As the Apache approached, Tall Tree raised his hand in greeting. "Ghost Rider," he said. "Na Ka Yen sent us to ensure your safe passage." "It seems we arrived at a good moment." Relief washed over Orville. "Your timing is impeccable," he acknowledged. "We're in your debt." Tall Tree dismounted and examined the bodies of the fallen raiders. "These men are known to us," he said grimly. "They prey on isolated settlements, Apache and white alike. The desert is better without them." With the Apache escort, the remainder of their journey to Tucson was uneventful. Tall Tree and his companions left them when the town came into view, melting back into the desert landscape with silent efficiency. As they rode into Tucson, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the dusty streets, Orville was acutely aware that their time together was coming to an end. The thought sat like a stone in his stomach. "I'll see you to the doctor's office," he said as they passed the town limits. Madeline nodded, her expression unreadable. The easy openness she had shown on their journey was now guarded, and Orville knew it was his doing his rejection of her honest questions the night before. Dr. Harrison was delighted to see them, particularly when Madeline reported on the successful treatment of the measles cases at San Carlos. "Remarkable work, Miss Rivers," he said, examining the wound on Orville's arm that Madeline had insisted needed professional attention. "And you, Mr. Harding, seem to have acquired more than a scratch in the process of this good deed." "It's nothing," Orville said, uncomfortable with the attention. "A bullet wound is hardly nothing," Dr. Harrison countered, cleaning the injury methodically. "But you're right that it's not serious. Keep it clean and it should heal well." With his arm bandaged, there was nothing left to delay the inevitable. Madeline had been silent throughout the doctor's ministrations, but now she turned to Orville. "Thank you again for everything," she said formally. "I couldn't have made the journey without your help." "Just doing what needed doing," he replied, the words feeling inadequate. "I should get going. Need to check in about that cattle drive." She nodded, a flicker of disappointment crossing her face before she masked it. "Of course. Safe travels, Orville." He hesitated, feeling as though he should say more but unsure what or how. In the end, he simply nodded and left, the weight of unspoken words pressing down on him. The Painted Rock Ranch lay 10 miles outside Tucson, a sprawling operation run by Wade Thornton, a fair but demanding boss. Orville had worked for him off and on for years, always reliable, always welcome. "Harding," Thornton greeted him as he rode into the ranch yard. "Beginning to think you weren't coming." "Had some business to attend to," Orville explained briefly. "We still on for the drive to Maricopa." "Had to push it back a few days," Thornton said. "Half the herd came down with some kind of sickness. Doc Sanders is treating them now, says they should be fit to travel by week's end." The news should have been frustrating delays meant lost money, but Orville found himself oddly relieved. "I'll help out around here until then," he offered. Thornton clapped him on the shoulder. "Knew I could count on you. Bunkhouse is open, same as always." The next few days fell into a familiar routine of ranch work, mending fences, checking the recovering herd, breaking in new horses. It was the kind of labor Orville knew well, that required skill but little thought, leaving his mind free to wander, and wander it did always back to Madeline. To her determination, her compassion, her directness. To the way she'd looked at him that night in the arroyo, asking if what they'd shared meant anything to him. By the third day, he could no longer ignore the persistent voice in his head telling him he'd made a mistake. That evening, after the day's work was done, he approached Thornton. "Need to head into town tomorrow," he said. "Personal matter." Thornton raised an eyebrow but asked no questions. "Be back by sundown. We're moving the herd to the north pasture." The next morning, Orville rode into Tucson earlier than necessary, taking extra care with his appearance, a fact that earned knowing looks from the ranch hands. He ignored them, focused on what he needed to do, though he wasn't entirely sure what that was. He found Madeline at the Territorial Health Commission office, a small building near the courthouse. When he entered, she was sorting papers at a desk, her hair pinned up in the neat bun he remembered from their first meeting. She looked up at the sound of the door, and the surprise on her face was quickly followed by a guarded expression. "Mr. Harding," she said formally, "is your arm troubling you?" "No," he said, suddenly feeling awkward. "It's healing fine." An uncomfortable silence stretched between them. "Is there something I can help you with?" she finally asked. Orville removed his hat, turning it in his hands. "I came to apologize," he said, "for how things ended after we got back." Her expression softened slightly. "There's no need for apology. You were clear about who you are and what you want." "That's just it," he said, forcing himself to continue despite the discomfort of expressing feelings he'd kept buried for so long. "I'm not sure I was clear, not even to myself." Madeline set down her papers, giving him her full attention. "What are you saying, Orville?" "I'm saying that I'm a man who spent most of his life alone by choice. I convinced myself it was better that way, safer. But these past days with you..." He paused, searching for the right words. "They made me question things I thought were settled." "What things?" she asked softly. "Whether being alone is really the only way for me, whether the reputation I've built, the life I've chosen, is all there is." He met her eyes directly. "Whether what happened between us might be worth exploring further." Madeline studied him for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. "And what conclusion did you reach?" "That I'd like to find out," he said simply. "If you're willing." A slow smile spread across her face, lighting her eyes in a way that made Orville's heart skip. "I think I might be," she said. "Though I should warn you, I'm as stubborn as Bessie and considerably more opinionated." That drew a rare laugh from him. "I noticed. And I have no intention of giving up my work," she continued more seriously. The people at San Carlos and other communities need medical care, regardless of what develops between us. I wouldn't ask you to, he assured her. Your dedication to helping others is part of what I admire about you. Admire, she echoed, a teasing note entering her voice. That's a start, I suppose. Orville took a step closer to her desk. It's more than that, he admitted, but I'm not good with words, better with actions. Then perhaps you should act, she suggested, rising from her chair. He closed the distance between them, placing his hat on her desk and tentatively reaching for her hand. When she didn't pull away, he drew her closer, his free hand gently touching her cheek. I'm not promising to change overnight, he warned. The solitary trail is a hard habit to break. I'm not asking for overnight, she replied. Just for honest effort and perhaps occasional escorts to Apache reservations. That I can manage, he said, and then, because words had never been his strength, he leaned down and kissed her. It was tentative at first, then deepened as Madeline responded, her arms sliding around his neck. When they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, Orville felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. Have dinner with me tonight, he asked. I'd like that, she agreed, her cheeks flushed. Though I should warn you, Tucson loves gossip. The fearsome ghost rider courting the commissioned nurse will be all over town by morning. Let them talk, he said, finding that he meant it. Been the subject of talk before. Their courtship progressed steadily over the following weeks. The cattle drive to Maricopa went smoothly, and upon his return, Orville found himself increasingly spending his free time with Madeline. They shared meals, took rides into the desert, and talked for hours about their pasts and potential futures. To his surprise, Orville found that opening himself to her was easier than he'd feared. The walls he'd built over years of solitude didn't crumble overnight, but they developed doorways, windows, places where Madeline could reach through, and he could reach out. He accompanied her on another journey to San Carlos, where they found the community recovering well from the measles outbreak. Many stars greeted them with knowing eyes, and Na Ka Yen merely nodded, as if their growing closeness was exactly what he had expected. The people of Tucson, as Madeline had predicted, found ample material for gossip in their relationship. The infamous loner cowboy and the dedicated nurse made an unusual pair, and speculation ran rampant about how long it would last. Heard Billy Jenkins place a bet that you'll be gone by month's end, Madeline mentioned one evening as they sat on the porch of her small rented house. Apparently, the consensus is that you're incapable of settling down. Orville sipped his coffee. And what do you think? She considered this, her expression thoughtful in the lantern light. I think people often confuse being alone with being lonely. You've mastered being alone, Orville. But I wonder if you were ever truly content with it. Her insight, as usual, cut to the heart of the matter. Maybe not, he admitted, but it was what I knew. And now, he reached for her hand, his calloused fingers entwining with hers. Now I'm learning something new. As summer gave way to fall, Orville found himself taking more permanent work at the Painted Rock Ranch, accepting Thornton's offer of a position as foreman. It meant less time on the trail but more stability, something he'd never prioritized before. He also began construction on a small house on a plot of land at the edge of Thornton's property, using skills he'd picked up over years of drifting. When Madeline questioned the purpose, he was uncharacteristically evasive. Just a project, he'd say. Something to keep my hands busy. The truth was that he was building it for her, for them, but the words stuck in his throat. Despite the deepening of their relationship, part of him still feared that expressing such hopes would somehow jinx them, that reaching for more would result in losing everything. Meanwhile, Madeline's work with the Health Commission expanded. Her successful interventions at San Carlos had earned her a reputation for effectiveness, and she was increasingly called upon to visit other communities in need. In late October, as Orville was putting the finishing touches on the house, a simple but solid structure with 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a covered porch, Madeline returned from a week-long trip to a mining settlement near the border. "I missed you," he said simply when she arrived at the ranch, taking the reins of her horse as she dismounted. "And I you," she replied, studying him. "You look different. Is everything all right?" He nodded, suddenly nervous. "I have something to show you." He led her to the newly completed house, watching her face as she took in the structure with its fresh-cut timber and stone chimney. "Orville," she breathed, "is this what you've been working on all these months?" "Come inside," he said by way of answer, leading her up the steps and through the door. The interior was sparsely furnished but clean and well-crafted. A stone fireplace dominated one wall of the main room, with simple but comfortable furniture arranged around it. The kitchen held a cast-iron stove and a table with 4 chairs. Through an open door, a bedroom was visible, with a handmade bed frame and a quilt Orville had commissioned from one of the ranch wives. Madeline walked through the space slowly, her fingers trailing over surfaces, her expression a mix of wonder and confusion. "It's beautiful," she said finally, "but I don't understand. You built this for yourself?" Orville took a deep breath, knowing he'd reached the moment of truth. "I built it for us," he said quietly, "if you want it." She turned to face him, eyes wide. "Are you asking me to marry you, Orville Harding? Not doing a very good job of it, am I?" he said ruefully. "Never thought I'd be in this position. Everyone always said the ghost rider would die alone, that I wasn't made for this." "And what do you think?" she asked, moving closer to him. He met her gaze steadily. "I think they were wrong. I think I've spent too many years believing I had to be alone to be strong. I think meeting you changed everything." He took her hands in his. "I love you, Madeline. Will you marry me?" Her eyes filled with tears, but her smile was radiant. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I will marry you, my stubborn, wonderful cowboy." He kissed her then, pouring all the emotion he'd once kept locked away into the embrace. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers. "I can't promise I'll be perfect at this," he warned. "Old habits die hard." "I'm not asking for perfect," she assured him. "Just for you, with all your complexities and contradictions. The man who can face down raiders without flinching but gets tongue-tied asking a simple question." He laughed, the sound echoing in the new house, their house. "When I'm with you, everything feels possible," he admitted. "Even things I never thought I wanted." They were married on a clear November day, with the desert in bloom after unexpected rains. The ceremony was small but well attended. Thornton and the ranch hands, Madeline's colleagues from the commission, and to the surprise of many in Tucson, a delegation from San Carlos led by Na Ka-yen and including many stars. Orville, dressed in the first new suit he'd owned in decades, watched with wonder as Madeline walked toward him in a simple white dress, her hair adorned with desert flowers. The preacher's words washed over him, but it was Madeline's voice, clear and confident as she said, "I do," that anchored him in the moment. When it was his turn, he spoke the words that would bind them together, his voice steady despite the emotion tightening his throat. "I do." And then came the pronouncement. "I now pronounce you husband and wife." As they turned to face their guests, Madeline squeezed his hand and whispered, "Husband." Orville smiled, a genuine, unguarded expression that few had ever seen from the man once known only as the Ghost Rider. "Wife," he replied, the word feeling both strange and right on his tongue. Later, at the celebration held at the Painted Rock Ranch, Na Ka-yen approached them with many stars. The elderly healer spoke at length in Apache, her gnarled hands gesturing expressively. She says she has seen many winters and many summers, Na Ka-yen translated. She has watched the white man's world collide with ours, bringing much sorrow. But today she sees hope. Two hearts from different paths joining as one, both dedicated to healing in their own ways. Many stars continued, her dark eyes fixed on Orville. She says to tell the ghost rider that her vision was true. You will not die alone, as was once your fate. You have chosen a new path, one that leads through love and family. Orville, normally uncomfortable with such personal declarations, found himself moved. Tell her I am grateful for her wisdom, he said, and that I hope to prove worthy of this new path. When this was translated, many stars nodded once, then reached out to place her hands on both their heads in a gesture of blessing before moving away. Quite a testimonial, Madeline commented, leaning against his side. How does it feel to defy prophecy, husband? The words sent a warmth through him that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. Better than I ever imagined, he admitted. As the celebration continued around them, Orville found himself in conversation with Wade Thornton, who had been watching him with a knowing smile. Never thought I'd see the day, Thornton said, clapping him on the shoulder. The legendary ghost rider tamed at last. Orville shook his head. Not tamed, he corrected. Just found. Thornton raised his glass, to finding what you didn't know you were looking for. I'll drink to that, Orville agreed, his eyes seeking out Madeline across the gathering. She was deep in conversation with one of the Apache women, her hands moving animatedly as she explained something medical. As if sensing his gaze, she looked up and smiled, a private expression just for him. In that moment, Orville knew with absolute certainty that he had made the right choice. The solitary trail had its own kind of freedom, but it paled in comparison to the liberty he'd found in loving and being loved by Madeline. Life settled into a rhythm that Orville would once have found unimaginable. He continued his work at the Painted Rock, while Madeline divided her time between the Health Commission office in Tucson and trips to communities in need. Often, when her journeys took her to more remote or potentially dangerous areas, Orville would accompany her. They became a familiar sight across the territory, the taciturn cowboy and the dedicated nurse, bringing medical care to places others overlooked. Their house became a home, filled with books, medical supplies, and the occasional stray animal that Madeline couldn't resist rescuing. Orville found himself collecting small treasures from their travels to add to their dwelling. A woven Apache basket, a Navajo rug, interesting rocks and feathers that caught his eye. In the spring of their first year of marriage, Madeline approached him with news that would once again reshape his world. I have something to tell you, she said one evening as they sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and purple. There was something in her voice that made him turn to study her face. What is it? She took his hand and placed it gently on her still flat stomach. We're going to have a child, she said, her eyes searching his for a reaction. For a moment, Orville couldn't speak, overwhelmed by a rush of emotions. Joy, fear, wonder, and a fierce protectiveness that took his breath away. A baby, he finally managed. Our baby, Madeline nodded, a smile spreading across her face at his evident awe. Due in late autumn, doctor. Harrison thinks. Are you happy about it? He asked, needing to be sure. Incredibly, she assured him. Though I admit I'm a bit nervous about balancing motherhood with my work. We'll figure it out together, he promised, drawing her into his arms. I never thought I'd have a family of my own. You've given me so much more than I ever dreamed possible. As Madeline's pregnancy progressed, Orville found himself experiencing a new kind of vulnerability. The thought of being responsible for a child, of being a father, was both exhilarating and terrifying. His own father had been a harsh, distant man who showed affection rarely and criticism freely. Orville was determined to do better. He threw himself into preparations, expanding the house to add a nursery, crafting a cradle with his own hands, and reading every book on childcare that Madeline could procure. His transformation from the solitary ghost rider to expectant father became the talk of Tucson, with many expressing surprise at the depth of his commitment. "Never seen a man more determined to get everything right," Dr. Harrison commented during one of Madeline's checkups. "You've worked quite the miracle with him, Mrs. Harding." "Not a miracle," Madeline corrected gently. "Just love and the courage to accept it." In October of 1879, as the desert cooled with the approach of winter, their son was born after a difficult but ultimately successful labor. Orville, who had refused to leave Madeline's side despite the doctor's initial protests, cradled the tiny boy in his arms with a reverence that brought tears to his wife's eyes. "What shall we name him?" Madeline asked, exhausted but radiant. Orville studied the small face, already seeing echoes of Madeline in the shape of the nose and chin. "What about Thomas?" he suggested. "After your father." Her eyes filled with tears. "Thomas Wade Harding," she agreed. "After my father and your friend who gave us the land for our home." As Thomas grew from infant to toddler, Orville discovered a capacity for patience and gentleness he hadn't known he possessed. The boy had his mother's curious nature and his father's quiet determination, creating a combination that often led him into mischief, but never malice. Madeline resumed her work with the Health Commission, though on a reduced schedule. Orville arranged his duties at the ranch to care for Thomas when she was away, becoming an unusually involved father for the era. The sight of the once feared ghost rider with a child perched on his shoulders became a common one in Tucson, generating amusement and admiration in equal measure. When Thomas was 3, Madeline gave birth to twins, a boy they named William and a girl called Sarah. Their family of 5 filled the house with noise, chaos, and a joy that Orville could never have imagined in his solitary days. Life wasn't without its challenges. The unforgiving nature of the frontier meant periodic droughts, occasional threats from outlaws, and the constant negotiation of the complex relationships between settlers and indigenous peoples. But they faced each obstacle together, their partnership growing stronger with each trial weathered. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Orville took Madeline on a special journey, retracing the route they had taken to San Carlos all those years ago. Much had changed in the intervening decade. The reservation system had evolved, though still far from perfect. Many stars had passed on, but Na Ka Yen remained, now an elder in his own right. They camped at the same arroyo where they had once sheltered from raiders, now with their 3 children excitedly helping to set up the tent and gather firewood under Orville's watchful eye. As the children finally slept, exhausted from their adventure, Orville and Madeline sat by the fire, her head resting on his shoulder. "You ever miss it?" she asked softly. "The freedom of the trail, answering to no one but yourself." Orville considered the question seriously, as he did all of Madeline's inquiries. "Sometimes," he admitted, "in the way you might miss the simplicity of childhood while still preferring the richness of adulthood." He turned to meet her gaze. "But I've found a different kind of freedom with you and the children. One that means more than all those empty miles ever did." She smiled, the firelight dancing in her eyes just as it had that night long ago when she had first asked if what they shared meant anything to him. "I'm glad," she said simply. You ever regret it? He asked in turn. Tying yourself to a man everyone said would die alone. Never, she answered without hesitation. From the moment you agreed to take me to San Carlos, I saw something in you that perhaps even you didn't recognize. A capacity for connection, for caring, that you'd buried beneath layers of solitude and self-protection. He pulled her closer, marveling at how this woman had seen through the facade he'd spent years perfecting. You changed everything, he murmured against her hair. We changed each other, she corrected. That's what love does when we let it. As the fire burned low and the desert night wrapped around them, Orville reflected on the journey that had brought him here, not just the physical distance from Tucson to this arroyo, but the emotional distance from the man he had been to the man he had become. Everyone had said the ghost rider would die alone, and for many years he had believed it himself. It had seemed a fitting end for a man who kept the world at arm's length, who valued independence above all else. But fate, in the form of a determined nurse with a mission, had intervened. And now, with his sleeping children a few feet away and his wife in his arms, Orville Harding knew he had found a truth far more valuable than any he had clung to in his solitary days. The true measure of a man wasn't in how well he could stand alone, but in how, fully, he could open himself to standing with others. As Madeline dozed against his shoulder, Orville whispered the words that still felt new, even after a decade of marriage. I love you, wife. And in her sleep, she smiled.